The mop bucket crashed to the floor, dirty water spreading across the pristine hospital corridor like spilled blood. Dr. Harrison's voice cut through the silence with surgical precision. Pathetic, absolutely pathetic. His words echoed off the sterile walls as Emma Rodriguez knelt among the scattered cleaning supplies, her uniform soaked, her dignity drowning in disinfectant. The gathered medical residents laughed, their white coats pristine and untouchable, but then it happened. As Emma reached for the fallen mop, her sleeve rode up, revealing a jagged scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow. The laughter died instantly. Dr. Martinez, the chief of surgery, went pale. His coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor. That scar told a story. A story that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning shift at Metropolitan General Hospital began like every other morning for the past 3 years. Emma Rodriguez arrived at 4:30 a.m., her beaten Honda Civic the first car in the staff parking garage's lowest level, where the overhead lighting flickered like dying fireflies and the concrete walls wept with moisture. She moved through the shadows with practiced invisibility, her cleaning cart rattling softly as she navigated toward the service elevator that would carry her to floors where real medicine happened, where lives hung in the balance, where she had once belonged. At 41, Emma had perfected the art of being overlooked, her black hair streaked with premature silver that spoke of stresses no one in this hospital could imagine, was always pulled back in a tight ponytail, secured with the same rubber band she had used for months. Her uniform, a faded blue that had once been navy, hung loose on her diminished frame. She had lost 30 pounds since arriving at Metro General, the weight falling away like shed armor as she transformed herself into someone who could disappear into the background of the medical world that had once celebrated her name. The scar on her left arm remained hidden beneath long sleeves, even in the suffocating heat of summer. Other scars decorated her body like a roadmap of violence and survival, each one telling a story that would never be shared in the breakroom conversations about weekend plans and family barbecues. The burn marks on her back from a collapsed field hospital in Somalia. The shrapnel wounds on her thigh from a mortar attack in Afghanistan. The surgical scars from the emergency procedures that had saved her life when conventional wisdom said she should have died. Emma's workstation in the basement custodial area was a testament to military precision that seemed out of place among the chaos of industrial cleaning equipment and neglected maintenance schedules. Every tool had its designated place. Every supply was catalogued and accounted for. Her small locker contained exactly 3 sets of uniforms, 2 pairs of work shoes, and a single photograph tucked behind her identification badge. The photograph showed 12 people in surgical scrubs standing outside a field hospital, their faces bright with exhaustion and triumph. 11 of those faces would never age another day. The hospital's day shift brought with it the familiar symphony of medical chaos, monitors beeping in critical care units, the urgent whispers of nurses discussing patient conditions, the authoritative voices of attending physicians making rounds with their entourages of residents and medical students. Emma moved through this world like a ghost, her presence acknowledged only when someone needed a mess cleaned or a spill mopped up. Dr. Richard Harrison represented everything that was wrong with modern academic medicine. At 55, he had spent the last decade climbing the administrative ladder at Metro General, his surgical skills relegated to minor procedures while he focused on the politics that determined hospital policy. His office walls were covered with certificates and awards that spoke more of his networking abilities than his medical competence. The residents under his supervision feared his sharp tongue and arbitrary cruelty, knowing that a single negative evaluation could derail their careers before they truly began. Harrison had made Emma his personal target from her first week at the hospital. Something about her calm competence irritated him, her refusal to cower under his verbal assaults challenging his authority in ways he could not articulate. He saw her as an affront to the natural order of the hospital hierarchy, a janitor who carried herself with indignity that seemed inappropriate for someone whose job involved cleaning toilets and emptying trash cans. The harassment began subtly, as these things always do. Harrison would find fault with Emma's work even when it was performed to perfection. He would schedule cleaning duties during shift changes when the hallways were crowded with medical personnel, forcing her to work around clusters of doctors and nurses who viewed her as an inconvenience. He took particular pleasure in assigning her the most degrading tasks, sending her to clean up after particularly messy procedures, or forcing her to sanitize areas that had already been cleaned by the overnight crew. The other custodial staff, taking their cue from Harrison's obvious disdain, began to distance themselves from Emma. They had their own job security to consider, and aligning themselves with someone who had clearly fallen from grace seemed like professional suicide. The isolation was systematic and complete, designed to break her spirit and force her to quit rather than endure the daily humiliation of her reduced circumstances. Emma's apartment, 15 miles from the hospital in a neighborhood that gentrification had not yet discovered, reflected the same Spartan discipline that governed every aspect of her existence. The walls were painted in neutral beige, devoid of personal touches that might reveal too much about her past. No medical diplomas adorned the surfaces, no photographs of colleagues or patients cluttered the spaces, nothing that might hint at the extraordinary life she had lived before choosing this path of deliberate anonymity. The only decoration was a small American flag in a simple frame, positioned where she could see it from her kitchen table during the solitary meals that had become her routine. Beside it sat a wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. Inside the box lay medals that would never see the light of day again. A bronze star with V device for valor under fire, a purple heart for wounds received in action, a presidential unit citation for extraordinary heroism. Each medal represented a moment when death had passed her by, leaving her alive to carry the weight of survival guilt that no amount of time could diminish. The summer heat in the city could be brutal, but Emma never removed her long-sleeved shirts, never allowed even the slightest glimpse of the scars that decorated her arms like a catalogue of violence and healing. The young residents would whisper about her strange habits, wondering why the janitor always ate lunch alone at the furthest table in the cafeteria, why she seemed to exist in a bubble of self-imposed isolation that even the most basic human kindness could not penetrate. Some speculated that she was running from something, perhaps an abusive relationship or legal troubles, but none of them could imagine the truth.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
They could not conceive that the woman who cleaned their operating rooms had once performed surgery under enemy fire, that her hands had saved more lives than most of them would ever touch in their entire careers. They saw only what she allowed them to see, a middle-aged woman whose life had somehow gone wrong, whose circumstances had reduced her to the most menial labor the hospital had to offer. Emma endured the daily humiliation with the same stoic resolve that had once carried her through 18-hour surgeries in forward operating bases where the sound of incoming mortars provided a constant backdrop to life-saving procedures. She accepted each insult as penance for sins that existed only in her own tortured conscience, the weight of survival pressing down upon her shoulders with crushing intensity. When the younger residents complained about their workload or the demands of their training, she would simply nod and continue her work, never revealing that she had once been responsible for surgical decisions that meant the difference between life and death for soldiers whose names would never appear in medical journals. Her hands, scarred from years of handling surgical instruments under combat conditions, moved with the fluid grace of someone who had performed these tasks when failure meant watching young men and women die on operating tables constructed from ammunition crates and covered with sterile drapes that could not hide the reality of war. But Emma Rodriguez had not always been invisible. Once she had been Dr. Emma Rodriguez, captain in the United States Army Medical Corps, one of the most skilled trauma surgeons ever to serve in forward operating bases across 3 continents. For 12 years she had moved through the world's most dangerous regions like a guardian angel, appearing where medical miracles were needed most and disappearing into the anonymity of classified after-action reports. Her surgical techniques had become legendary among military medical personnel who understood that conventional procedures meant nothing when performed in tents where temperature control was a luxury and sterile fields were maintained through sheer force of will. She had performed surgery during mortar attacks, her hands steady as the earth shook around her. She had operated by flashlight when generators failed, using techniques improvised from years of experience in conditions that would have paralyzed civilian surgeons. Her service record, sealed in the deepest vaults of military medical archives, told the story of a healer who had redefined what it meant to practice medicine under fire. The commendations that bore her name would never see the light of day, their citations locked away with the details of operations that officially never happened. She had walked through the valley of death across 4 continents, her surgical skills saving lives in ways that would remain forever unknown to the American people she had sworn to protect. Her team at Forward Operating Base Delta had become her family, 11 medical professionals who had accepted her not because of diversity initiatives or political correctness but because she had proven herself in the crucible of combat medicine. They had watched her operate for 16 hours straight during a mass casualty event in Iraq, seen her carry wounded soldiers to safety when their position came under fire, witnessed her perform procedures that civilian medical schools claimed were impossible under field conditions. Dr. James Chen, their anesthesiologist, could maintain unconsciousness in patients using techniques developed in field conditions where traditional monitoring was impossible. Nurse Patricia Williams could anticipate surgical needs with an intuition that bordered on telepathy, her hands always reaching for the right instrument before Emma could ask for it. Corpsman Michael Thompson could establish IV access in patients whose veins had collapsed from blood loss, his skills honed by years of treating trauma that would have overwhelmed civilian emergency rooms. Each member of the team represented years of training and millions of dollars in government investment, but more importantly, each was a brother or sister who had earned their place through dedication to the mission of saving lives under impossible conditions. They had operated together for 4 years, their bond transcending the typical professional relationships of medical teams to become something approaching sacred trust. Emma had earned her place among them not through rank or political pressure but through actions that spoke louder than any credentials could convey. She had been the first to volunteer for the most dangerous assignments, the last to seek rest when casualties poured into their facility, the one who could be counted on to maintain surgical standards even when conventional wisdom suggested that such precision was impossible under combat conditions. The team had initially been skeptical of having a relatively young surgeon assigned to their unit, but that skepticism had evaporated during their first major engagement in Afghanistan. When their facility had been overrun by casualties from a convoy attack, Emma had performed 17 consecutive surgeries over a 20-hour period, her hands never trembling despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her focus. She had saved the life of a young soldier whose injuries were so severe that conventional medical wisdom suggested he should be made comfortable and allowed to die with dignity. Instead, she had spent 6 hours reconstructing his abdomen using techniques that she improvised on the spot, her determination to save every life becoming the standard by which the entire team measured their own performance. From that moment forward, she had been more than their colleague. She had been their conscience, their inspiration, and their reminder that the practice of medicine under fire was not just about following protocols but about finding ways to preserve life when death seemed inevitable. The bond they shared transcended the typical camaraderie of medical teams to become something approaching religious devotion to the preservation of human life. The mission that changed everything had taken place in the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where intelligence suggested that a high-value target was planning an attack using chemical weapons stolen from Syrian stockpiles. The target, a former university chemistry professor turned terrorist coordinator, had acquired materials that could create a biological weapon capable of contaminating water supplies across multiple major cities. Emma's team had been tasked with providing medical support for a joint operation designed to eliminate the threat before it could materialize, a routine assignment that should have concluded with the successful extraction of captured materials and the elimination of terrorist leadership. The medical component of the mission was straightforward: establish a forward aid station that could treat both friendly and enemy casualties while maintaining operational security in hostile territory. Her team consisted of 11 of the most skilled medical professionals the military had ever produced, each one representing years of specialized training in combat medicine. They had deployed together to 6 different theaters of operation, their expertise saving lives in conditions that would have overwhelmed civilian medical facilities. Each member of the team was a specialist whose skills had been honed by years of treating trauma under fire. Dr. Chen had developed techniques for maintaining anesthesia using improvised equipment and locally sourced medications when supply lines were disrupted by enemy action. Nurse Williams could establish surgical fields in environments where traditional sterile procedures were impossible, her innovations in field sanitation becoming standard protocol for forward medical units. Corpsman Thompson could treat traumatic injuries using techniques that combined traditional medicine with battlefield improvisation. They had operated together for 4 years, the bond transcending professional relationships to become something approaching family. Emma had earned her place among them not through quotas or political pressure but through actions that demonstrated her commitment to the mission of preserving life under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The team had initially questioned whether a young surgeon could handle the psychological pressures of combat medicine, but those concerns had disappeared during their first deployment together in Iraq. When their aid station had been targeted by a coordinated mortar attack, Emma had continued operating while explosions shook the facility, her hands steady as she completed a procedure that saved the life of a critically wounded soldier. She had refused to evacuate her patients even when ordered to abandon the position, instead organizing a medical evacuation under fire that preserved the lives of 12 wounded personnel who would have died if left behind. Her willingness to risk her own life for the soldiers under her care had earned the respect of every member of the team, establishing a standard of dedication that became the foundation of their collective identity. The ambush came at dawn on the third day when they believed the primary mission was nearing completion. Intelligence had been compromised, their position revealed to an enemy that had been waiting for them with the patience of predators who understood that the greatest victories came from allowing prey to feel secure before striking with overwhelming force. The first indication of trouble came from the perimeter guards whose radio calls reported movement in the surrounding hills that suggested a coordinated assault was imminent. Emma's first instinct was to begin preparing for mass casualties, organizing her team to receive wounded from what appeared to be developing into a significant engagement between friendly forces and a larger enemy element than intelligence had predicted. The medical facility, established in a valley that provided natural concealment from aerial observation, suddenly became a trap when enemy forces occupied the high ground on all sides. The protective terrain that had seemed advantageous during planning now worked against them, creating a natural amphitheater where enemy fire could be concentrated with devastating effect. The attack began with mortar rounds that fell like steel rain, each explosion sending shrapnel through the air with the sound of angry hornets seeking targets. Emma's training took over immediately, her mind shifting into the focused calm that had carried her through dozens of similar situations. She began triaging wounded soldiers as they were brought to the aid station, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she determined who could be saved and who was beyond the reach of medical intervention. For 18 hours the team worked under fire, their medical skills challenged by wounds that defied conventional treatment protocols. Emma performed surgery while mortar rounds exploded nearby, her concentration absolute as she worked to save lives in conditions that would have been impossible for surgeons without combat experience. Each procedure was a race against time, with enemy fire making evacuation impossible and supply shortages limiting the tools available for life-saving interventions. One by one her team members fell around her, their positions overrun by enemy forces that seemed to materialize from the rocky terrain like ghosts seeking vengeance. Dr. Chen died first, his position targeted by a rocket-propelled grenade that eliminated the makeshift anesthesia station he had constructed from medical supplies and captured equipment. Nurse Williams lasted until midday, her nursing station finally overwhelmed by enemy combatants who had infiltrated the perimeter through positions that should have been impregnable. Corpsman Thompson fought until his ammunition ran out, then drew his sidearm and continued providing medical care till a sniper's bullet found its mark. Emma watched each death through the scope of her rifle, forced to divide her attention between providing medical care and defending the remaining wounded soldiers who depended on her for survival.
She had been forced to make the hardest decision of her medical career, calling in close air support on her own position when it became clear that extraction was impossible and the wounded under her care would be executed if captured. The bombs fell like judgment from heaven, obliterating the enemy force but taking her team with them, 11 names that would never appear on any memorial dedicated to medical personnel who had died in service to their country. The explosion that followed seemed to split the earth itself, a man-made earthquake that buried friend and foe alike beneath tons of shattered rock and twisted metal. Emma's survival had been a matter of inches and seconds, her position in a natural depression providing just enough protection to preserve her life while everything she had worked to build was destroyed around her. For 6 days she had evaded capture in enemy territory, her medical training keeping her alive when conventional survival skills would have failed. She had treated her own wounds using techniques learned from years of battlefield medicine, cauterizing injuries with heated metal and creating surgical closures using materials scavenged from the destroyed aid station. She had eaten insects and plant matter that her medical knowledge identified as safe for consumption, had purified water using techniques that combined chemistry with desperation, had slept in caves while enemy patrols passed within feet of her hiding place. Her escape had been a masterpiece of endurance and medical knowledge, using her understanding of human physiology to push her body beyond normal limits. The extraction, when it finally came, had been a miracle of timing and courage, with a helicopter crew risking their lives to pull her from a mountainside landing zone that barely qualified as suitable for aircraft operations.
The debriefing that followed had been a nightmare of accusations and political maneuvering, with Pentagon officials more concerned about the implications of the mission's failure than the sacrifice of 12 medical professionals who had died trying to save lives. The congressional hearing that followed had been a masterpiece of political theater, with classified details used as weapons against her while she remained forbidden from defending herself or her team. Senators who had never treated a battlefield injury questioned her judgment, her competence, her very right to practice medicine under conditions they could not comprehend. The media had painted her as a reckless female surgeon who had endangered her team through poor judgment, a narrative that served the political needs of those who preferred simple explanations to complex truths. Television commentators debated her qualifications while never mentioning the classified commendations that filled her service record, the successful missions that had saved countless lives, the respect she had earned from every medical professional who had served beside her. Death threats had begun arriving at her apartment within days of the hearing, letters filled with venom and hatred from people who knew nothing about her service but everything about their own prejudices. The final insult had come when she was offered a choice: accept responsibility for the mission's failure and retire with reduced benefits, or face a court-martial that would destroy her reputation and potentially reveal classified information that could endanger other medical personnel. She had chosen exile, transforming herself into someone who could disappear into the civilian world without leaving a trace of her former identity. The woman who had once been America's most decorated combat surgeon became a ghost in truth, haunting the edges of the medical world that had once been her home, her skills hidden beneath the coveralls of a hospital janitor who cleaned the operating rooms where other surgeons saved lives. The annual Joint Commission inspection brought attention to Metropolitan General Hospital that could be felt in every department, from the executive boardrooms to the basement storage areas where Emma spent her days in carefully maintained invisibility. Dr. Patricia Martinez, the newly appointed chief of surgery, led the inspection team with the confidence of someone who had built her reputation on surgical excellence rather than political maneuvering. Her presence represented everything that Harrison aspired to become but never would: a physician whose skills in the operating room were matched only by her ability to inspire others through example rather than intimidation. The inspection was Harrison's opportunity to demonstrate his administrative competence to someone whose opinion could determine the trajectory of his career. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, orchestrating every detail to showcase his leadership abilities while simultaneously positioning himself as the natural successor to the aging department head who was rumored to be considering retirement. De extras en wismender dit Bitinia Vendedielos were Dina Manning de Bitinia Vendedielos Beferes and demanding de Bitinia Vendedielos Beferes of Old Borch with Cirrus Bitinia Vendedielos with Sirius while common yours Cirrus. Simonetti. Emma represented the perfect prop for his performance, a convenient target whose degraded circumstances would allow him to demonstrate his authority while reinforcing the hospital's commitment to maintaining high standards among all personnel. He had planned this demonstration for days, recognizing that the presence of the chief of surgery would provide the perfect audience for a lesson in proper workplace hierarchy. The main conference room had been transformed into a showcase of medical professionalism, with department heads arranged in carefully orchestrated seating that reflected the hospital's power structure. Harrison had positioned himself at the head of the table, his white coat pristine and his confidence radiating the self-assurance of someone who believed that his moment of triumph was finally at hand. The summons came during the afternoon shift change, when the hospital corridors were crowded with medical personnel transitioning between duties. Emma received the message through a maintenance supervisor who clearly found the entire situation distasteful but lacked the authority to question orders from senior medical staff. She was instructed to bring her cleaning supplies to the main conference room for what Harrison described as a demonstration of proper sanitation procedures. The walk to the conference room felt like a march to execution, with Emma's footsteps echoing through corridors that she had once walked with the confidence of someone whose skills could mean the difference between life and death. Now she pushed her cleaning cart past medical students and residents who stepped aside to avoid contact with someone they viewed as an obstacle to their important work. The conference room doors opened to reveal a gathering that represented the pinnacle of medical authority at Metropolitan General. Department heads who controlled budgets worth millions of dollars, senior physicians whose decisions affected thousands of patients annually, administrative officials whose policies shaped the daily operations of one of the city's most prestigious medical institutions. Harrison's voice filled the room with practiced authority as he began what he clearly viewed as a masterpiece of administrative theater. The assembled physicians shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing that they were about to witness something that had nothing to do with quality improvement and everything to do with Harrison's personal agenda. Emma entered the room with the same measured pace that had once carried her through field hospitals where wounded soldiers depended on her steady presence for their survival. Her cleaning cart rattled softly against the polished floors, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the silence that had settled over the gathering like a funeral shroud. Harrison gestured toward a corner of the room where someone had deliberately spilled coffee and scattered papers, creating an artificial mess that would serve as the foundation for his demonstration. His smile carried the predatory satisfaction of someone who believed that he was about to deliver a lesson that would be remembered long after the inspection concluded. The task he assigned was deliberately humiliating, requiring Emma to clean the spill while the assembled medical professionals observed her technique. He critiqued every movement, questioning her methods with the condescending tone of someone addressing a particularly slow student. The physicians in the room watched with growing discomfort, recognizing that they were witnessing something that had nothing to do with maintaining standards and everything to do with cruelty. Emma completed the assigned task with methodical precision, her movements efficient and professional despite the hostile environment. Her hands, scarred from years of handling surgical instruments under combat conditions, worked with the same steady competence that had once saved lives in operating theaters where failure meant watching young soldiers die on makeshift tables. The cleaning solution she used was applied with the exact concentration recommended by infection control protocols. Her technique for removing stains followed procedures that would have impressed any environmental services supervisor. Even under these degrading circumstances, her work met standards that exceeded anything Harrison could have reasonably expected. But professionalism was not the point of this exercise. Harrison had orchestrated this demonstration to establish dominance, to remind everyone present that hierarchy existed for important reasons and that challenging authority would result in consequences that extended far beyond simple workplace discipline. Dr. Martinez watched the proceedings with growing disgust, her expression shifting from professional interest to barely contained anger as she realized that she was witnessing an elaborate exercise in workplace bullying rather than any legitimate evaluation of cleaning procedures. Her reputation had been built on treating all hospital personnel with respect, recognizing that patient care to care depended on the contributions of every member of the medical team. The breaking point came when Harrison decided that Emma's work required additional correction. He knocked over her carefully organized cleaning supplies, sending bottles and brushes scattering across the polished conference room floor. The crash echoed through the room like gunfire, causing several physicians to flinch at the sudden violence of the gesture. Emma knelt to retrieve her scattered equipment, her movements careful and controlled despite the obvious humiliation of the moment. Her uniform was soaked with cleaning solution, the chemical smell overwhelming in the confined space of the conference room. The assembled physicians watched in uncomfortable silence as she methodically gathered each item, restoring order to chaos with the same patience that had once characterized her approach to emergency surgery. As she reached for a bottle that had rolled beneath the conference table, her sleeve caught on the table leg and tore along the seam. The fabric parted with a soft ripping sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence of the room. The tear exposed several inches of her left forearm, revealing for the first time in 3 years the jagged scar that ran from her wrist toward her elbow. The scar was impossible to ignore, its raised edges catching the fluorescent lighting in ways that emphasized the violence of whatever had caused the original injury. The wound had clearly been severe, the kind of trauma that would have required multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation to restore even partial function to the damaged limb. Dr. Martinez had seen thousands of scars during her medical career, but this one was different. The pattern of the injury, the way it curved around the bones of the forearm, the secondary scarring that indicated multiple surgical interventions, all suggested trauma that went far beyond civilian accidents or routine medical procedures. This was the kind of injury that resulted from explosive devices or high-velocity projectiles, the signature wounds that she had learned to recognize during her residency at a Level 1 trauma center. Her coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers as the implications of what she was seeing began to penetrate her consciousness. The porcelain shattered against the conference room floor, sending fragments skittering across the polished surface like scattered thoughts trying to coalesce into understanding. The sound of breaking ceramic cut through the tension in the room like a blade, causing heads to turn toward the chief of surgery, whose normally composed demeanor had cracked along with her coffee cup. Her face had gone pale beneath her professional makeup, her eyes fixed on Emma's exposed forearm with an intensity that suggested recognition rather than simple curiosity. Harrison's laughter filled the awkward silence, his amusement at the chief's clumsiness providing him with another opportunity to demonstrate his superiority over someone whose reputation far exceeded his own. He saw only an accident, a moment of inattention that proved even senior physicians were fallible under pressure. But Dr. Martinez was not looking at the broken cup. Her attention remained focused on the scar that Emma was desperately trying to conceal, pulling the torn fabric over the exposed skin with movements that betrayed years of practice in hiding evidence of her former life. The pattern of scarring was unmistakable to someone who had spent years treating combat casualties during her own military service. The injury had been caused by shrapnel, probably from an improvised explosive device or mortar round, and the surgical repairs bore the hallmarks of battlefield medicine performed under less than ideal conditions. More telling than the original wound were the secondary scars that surrounded it, evidence of multiple procedures performed to restore function to damaged muscle and nerve tissue. This was not the result of a single traumatic event, but rather a complex injury that had required the attention of highly skilled surgeons working in conditions where conventional treatment protocols might not have been possible. Dr. Martinez had seen similar injuries during her own deployment as a Navy surgeon aboard hospital ships in the Mediterranean, where she had treated wounded soldiers evacuated from combat zones across North Africa and the Middle East. The techniques used to repair Emma's arm represented the kind of innovative surgery that was performed only in forward medical facilities where traditional resources were unavailable. The silence in the conference room stretched like a held breath, with the assembled physicians sensing that something significant was happening without understanding the nature of the revelation. Harrison continued his performance, oblivious to the undercurrents of recognition that were transforming the atmosphere in ways that would soon render his authority meaningless. Emma remained kneeling among her scattered cleaning supplies, her torn sleeve a window into a past that she had spent 3 years trying to forget. The scar throbbed with phantom pain, a reminder of the night when everything had changed, when her world had exploded in fire and smoke and the screams of wounded soldiers who depended on her skills for their survival. Dr. Martinez found her voice after what seemed like an eternity, her words cutting through Harrison's self-congratulatory commentary with surgical precision. The single word she spoke carried the weight of recognition, of shared experience, of understanding that transcended the artificial barriers that separated physicians from support staff. The name she whispered was barely audible above the ambient noise of the hospital's ventilation system, but it hit Emma like a physical blow. 3 years of carefully constructed anonymity crumbled in that instant, her protective facade shattered by someone who had known her in another life, when she had worn captain's bars instead of janitor's coveralls. Harrison's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to confusion as he watched the chief of surgery stare at his favorite target with something approaching reverence. The power dynamics in the room began to shift like tectonic plates grinding against each other, threatening to reshape the landscape of authority that he had worked so hard to establish. The other physicians sensed the change without understanding its source, their attention shifting between Harrison's obvious confusion and Martinez's intense focus on a woman they had dismissed as unworthy of their notice. The atmosphere in the conference room transformed from one of professional evaluation to something that felt more like a military tribunal, with Emma at the center of attention for reasons that no one could fully comprehend. Dr. Martinez rose from her seat with movements that seemed weighted with significance, her approach toward Emma measured and deliberate. Each step carried her further from the safety of her executive position and closer to a truth that would reshape everything the assembled physicians thought they understood about the woman who cleaned their operating rooms. Emma remained motionless as the chief of surgery knelt beside her, professional dignity abandoned in favor of something more important. The two women faced each other across the scattered cleaning supplies, their shared understanding creating a bubble of intimacy that excluded everyone else in the room. The whispered conversation that followed was conducted in medical terminology that the other physicians could barely follow, references to surgical procedures and anatomical structures that seemed to have nothing to do with cleaning supplies or workplace discipline. But the emotional weight of the exchange was unmistakable, two professionals recognizing each other across a gulf of circumstance that should have made communication impossible. Harrison's protests grew louder as he realized that his carefully orchestrated demonstration was spiraling beyond his control. His authority, so carefully maintained through months of systematic intimidation, was evaporating in the face of something he could not understand or control. But Dr. Martinez was no longer listening to his complaints. Her attention remained focused on Emma, on the scars that told stories of sacrifice and service, on the recognition that was dawning like sunrise after the longest night imaginable. The revelation that would change everything was still moments away, but the foundation had been laid by a torn sleeve and a broken coffee cup, by the convergence of past and present that neither woman had expected but both had perhaps unconsciously sought. In the tense silence of the conference room, surrounded by physicians who represented the pinnacle of medical authority, Emma Rodriguez felt the walls of her carefully constructed anonymity beginning to crumble. The woman who had spent 3 years invisible was about to become the center of attention in ways that would reshape every relationship in the room. The torn fabric that exposed her scarred forearm had opened a door to the past that could never be closed again. The comfortable obscurity that had protected her from questions and recognition was about to be shattered by someone who remembered when she had worn different clothes and carried different responsibilities, when her hands had held surgical instruments instead of cleaning supplies. Dr. Martinez's recognition was spreading through the room like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, each physician beginning to sense that they were witnessing something extraordinary without yet understanding its nature. The woman they had ignored for 3 years was about to be revealed as someone whose presence among them represented a tragedy of circumstances that none of them could have imagined. Martinez's voice carried across the conference room with the authority of someone who had commanded respect in the world's most dangerous medical environments. Her words cut through Harrison's protests like a scalpel through infected tissue, each syllable precisely chosen for maximum impact on an audience that was about to have their understanding of reality fundamentally altered. "Show them your other arm, Captain Rodriguez," she said, using a title that caused every physician in the room to freeze in their chairs. The rank meant nothing to most civilian doctors, but the way Martinez spoke it carried implications that transcended military hierarchy. This was not a request but a command issued by someone who understood the true cost of the scars hidden beneath Emma's torn sleeve. Emma's reaction was immediate and visceral, her body tensing as if she had been struck by an electrical current. 3 years of carefully maintained anonymity hung in the balance, the protective shell she had constructed around her new identity threatening to crack under the pressure of recognition. Her right hand moved instinctively to cover the torn fabric, a gesture that spoke of months spent learning to hide evidence of her former life. The silence that followed Martinez's command stretched like a guitar string tuned beyond its breaking point. Department heads who controlled multi-million-dollar budgets found themselves holding their breath, sensing that they were about to witness something that would reshape their understanding of the woman they had dismissed as merely another member of the hospital's support staff. Harrison's face underwent a transformation that would have been amusing under different circumstances, confusion giving way to anger as he realized that his authority was being challenged by someone whose opinion actually mattered in the hospital's power structure. His voice rose in pitch as he attempted to reassert control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his comprehension. "What is this nonsense about captains and military ranks?" he demanded, his words carrying the desperate edge of someone who sensed that the foundation of his carefully constructed worldview was beginning to shift beneath his feet. "This woman is a janitor, nothing more than a civilian contractor who can barely manage to clean floors without supervision." But Martinez was no longer listening to Harrison's protests. Her attention remained focused on Emma, on the recognition that had passed between them like an electric current connecting two souls who had shared experiences that could never be fully communicated to those who had not lived through similar trials. Emma's hands trembled as she slowly rolled up the sleeve of her right arm, revealing skin that told a different story than the administrative records that defined her current existence. The scars that emerged were not random marks of violence but rather a carefully organized catalog of medical procedures performed under conditions that would have challenged the most skilled civilian surgeons. The primary wound ran from her elbow to her wrist, a jagged line that spoke of explosive trauma and emergency surgery performed in environments where sterile fields were a luxury that could not always be maintained. But it was the secondary scarring that told the real story, the precise lines that indicated multiple reconstructive procedures designed to restore function to damaged muscle and nerve tissue. Surgical clips were still visible beneath the skin, tiny metal markers that had been left in place to guide follow-up procedures that would never come. The spacing and placement of these clips revealed the kind of meticulous surgical planning that was performed only by physicians who understood that every decision could mean the difference between functional recovery and permanent disability. Dr. Martinez recognized the techniques immediately, having performed similar procedures during her own deployment aboard Navy hospital ships where wounded soldiers arrived with injuries that defied conventional treatment protocols. The surgical approach used to repair Emma's arm represented innovations in battlefield medicine that had been developed by doctors who had no choice but to improvise solutions to problems that civilian medical schools never taught. But the scars on Emma's arms were only the beginning of the revelation that would transform every relationship in the room. As she continued to roll up her sleeves, more evidence of her former life became visible to physicians who were beginning to understand that they had been working alongside someone whose medical experience far exceeded their own. A small tattoo became visible near her right shoulder, partially obscured by scar tissue but still legible to anyone who understood military medical symbolism. The caduceus intertwined with crossed scalpels marked her as a member of an elite medical unit, the kind of specialized team that was deployed only when conventional medical resources were inadequate for the challenges they would face. Dr. Martinez moved closer, her professional composure cracking as she recognized symbols that she had seen only in classified briefings and after-action reports. The tattoo represented membership in units that officially did not exist, medical teams that operated in the gray areas between conventional military medicine and special operations support. Task Force Hippocrates, Martinez whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the hospital's ventilation system. The name meant nothing to most of the assembled physicians, but it hit Emma like a physical blow, dredging up memories that she had spent 3 years trying to suppress. Harrison's protests grew louder as he realized that he was losing control of a situation that he had orchestrated to demonstrate his authority. His voice rose to near shouting levels as he demanded explanations for what he viewed as an elaborate charade designed to undermine his position within the hospital hierarchy. "This is ridiculous," he declared, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "I don't care what kind of military fantasy this woman has constructed for herself. She is a janitor who has consistently failed to meet basic performance standards, and I will not allow her to disrupt this inspection with delusional claims about some imaginary military service." But the other physicians in the room were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple personnel dispute. The scars they could see were too extensive, too precisely repaired to be the result of civilian accidents. The surgical techniques evident in Emma's healing spoke of medical interventions performed by physicians who operated at the very highest levels of trauma surgery. Dr. Martinez turned to address the assembled department heads, her voice carrying the weight of someone who was about to reveal information that would challenge everything they thought they knew about military medicine and the physicians who practiced it in the world's most dangerous environments. Task Force Hippocrates was a joint military medical unit that provided surgical support for classified operations across 3 continents, she explained. Her words causing several physicians to lean forward in their chairs as they began to grasp the significance of what they were learning. The unit was composed of 12 medical professionals who were selected from the most elite trauma surgeons in the military medical system. The numbers meant something to Emma that they could not mean to anyone else in the room. 12 medical professionals who had become family through shared sacrifice and mutual dependence. 11 names that would never appear on any memorial dedicated to military medical personnel who had died in service to their country. Martinez continued her explanation, each detail adding weight to a revelation that was reshaping the atmosphere in the conference room like a storm system gathering strength. The unit had been deployed to locations that did not officially exist, providing medical support for operations that were never acknowledged by Pentagon officials who swore under oath that no such missions had ever been authorized. For 6 years the team had moved through the world's most dangerous regions like medical angels, appearing where life-saving surgery was needed most and disappearing into the anonymity of classified after-action reports. Their techniques had become legendary among military medical personnel who understood that conventional procedures meant nothing when performed in environments where traditional resources were unavailable. Emma had been the unit's lead trauma surgeon, responsible for procedures that pushed the boundaries of what was medically possible under combat conditions. She had performed surgery during artillery bombardments, her hands steady as explosive concussions shook the earth around her makeshift operating theater. She had operated by candlelight when generators failed, using techniques improvised from years of experience in conditions that would have paralyzed civilian surgeons. The commendations that bore her name would never see the light of day, their citations locked away with the details of operations that officially never happened. She had walked through the valley of death across 4 continents, her surgical skills saving lives in ways that would remain forever unknown to the American people she had sworn to protect. Doctor. Martinez's voice took on a tone of reverence as she described operations that had redefined what it meant to practice medicine under fire. Emma had performed 17 consecutive surgeries during a mass casualty event in Syria, her endurance and skill keeping wounded soldiers alive until evacuation became possible. She had operated in field hospitals that came under direct attack, continuing procedures while bullets shattered windows and explosive fragments embedded themselves in the walls around her. She developed surgical techniques that are now standard protocol in military medical facilities worldwide. Martinez continued, her words causing the assembled physicians to stare at Emma with growing amazement. Her innovations in emergency vascular repair saved hundreds of lives in situations where conventional treatments would have failed. The revelation hit the department heads like a physical blow, forcing them to reconsider every interaction they had witnessed over the past 3 years. The woman they had dismissed as an inadequate janitor had once been responsible for medical decisions that meant the difference between life and death for soldiers whose names would never appear in medical journals. Harrison's face underwent another transformation as the implications of what he was hearing began to penetrate his consciousness. The woman he had systematically humiliated for months was being described as one of the most skilled trauma surgeons in modern military history, a physician whose innovations had influenced medical practice at the highest levels of military medicine. But Martinez was not finished with her revelations. The worst was yet to come, the truth about why Emma Rodriguez was cleaning floors instead of saving lives in operating rooms where her skills could benefit thousands of patients who needed the kind of expertise that only came from years of practicing medicine under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The mission that ended everything took place in the mountains of Afghanistan. Martinez continued, her voice heavy with the weight of classified information that she was revealing for the first time to an audience that had no security clearance to hear such details. Intelligence suggested that terrorist forces had acquired chemical weapons that could contaminate water supplies across multiple major cities. The medical component of the mission was straightforward in concept but terrifyingly complex in execution. Emma's team was tasked with establishing a forward medical facility that could treat casualties from a joint operation designed to eliminate the chemical weapons threat before it could be deployed against civilian populations. The facility they constructed represented the pinnacle of battlefield medicine, a fully functional trauma center built from prefabricated components and powered by portable generators that could maintain life support systems even under combat conditions. The team had worked for 72 hours straight to prepare medical capabilities that could handle massive casualties while maintaining operational security in hostile territory. Emma's surgical suite was a masterpiece of improvised engineering, equipped with monitoring systems that could track multiple patients simultaneously while providing the sterile environment necessary for complex procedures. Her supply inventory included blood products that had been flown in from Germany, surgical instruments that had been sterilized using techniques developed specifically for forward deployment, and medications that could sustain life even when conventional treatments were unavailable. The ambush that destroyed everything came without warning, enemy forces that had been tracking the medical team's movements for days finally striking with overwhelming force. The attack began with mortar rounds that targeted the medical facility with surgical precision, as if the enemy had detailed intelligence about the exact location of every piece of equipment and every member of the medical team. Emma's first response was to begin preparing for mass casualties, organizing her team to receive wounded soldiers from what appeared to be developing into a significant engagement. But the protective terrain that had seemed advantageous during mission planning suddenly became a trap when enemy forces occupied the high ground on all sides of the medical facility. For 24 hours the medical team worked under fire, their skills challenged by wounds that defied conventional treatment protocols. Emma performed surgery while explosive rounds detonated nearby, her concentration absolute as she worked to save lives in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance and medical capability. One by one her team members fell around her, their positions overrun by enemy forces that seemed to possess detailed knowledge of the facility's defensive capabilities.
Dr. James Patterson, their anesthesiologist, died when a rocket-propelled grenade destroyed the generator that powered his monitoring equipment. Nurse Lieutenant Sarah Kim lasted until evening, her position finally overwhelmed by enemy combatants who had spent hours maneuvering through rocky terrain to reach her aid station.
Corpsman Daniel Rodriguez fought until his ammunition was exhausted, then drew his sidearm and continued providing medical care until sniper fire ended his resistance. Emma watched each death through windows that had been shattered by explosive fragments, forced to divide her attention between performing surgery and defending the wounded soldiers who depended on her for survival. The decision that haunted her dreams came when extraction became impossible and the wounded under her care faced certain execution if captured. She had been forced to call in close air support on her own position, sacrificing her medical team to prevent terrorist forces from acquiring intelligence that could have compromised other operations across the region. The bombs fell like divine judgment, obliterating enemy positions but taking her medical family with them. 11 names that would never appear on any memorial wall dedicated to military medical personnel who had died in service to their country. 11 families that would receive folded flags and carefully worded letters that revealed nothing about how their loved ones had actually died. Emma's survival had been a matter of inches and cruel fortune, her position in a reinforced bunker providing just enough protection to preserve her life while everything she had worked to build was destroyed around her. The explosion that followed seemed to split the earth itself, a man-made earthquake that buried friend and foe alike beneath tons of shattered rock and twisted metal. For 8 days she had evaded capture in enemy territory, her medical knowledge keeping her alive when conventional survival training would have failed. She had treated her own wounds using supplies scavenged from the destroyed medical facility, performing procedures on herself that would have challenged surgeons working under ideal conditions. The extraction, when it finally came, had been a miracle of timing and military precision, with special operations forces risking their lives to pull her from a mountainside landing zone that was under constant enemy observation. The helicopter that carried her to safety had taken fire during the entire flight, crew members wounded by bullets that penetrated the aircraft's armor plating. Martinez's voice cracked with emotion as she described the aftermath of the mission, the political calculations that had transformed a medical hero into a convenient scapegoat for decisions made by officials who had never treated a combat casualty. The congressional hearings that followed had been exercises in political theater, with classified details weaponized against Emma while she remained forbidden from defending herself or her fallen teammates. Senators who had never seen the inside of an operating room questioned her judgment and competence, her right to practice medicine under conditions they could not comprehend. The media painted her as a reckless surgeon who had endangered her team through poor decision-making, a narrative that served the political needs of those who preferred simple explanations to complex truths. Television commentators debated her qualifications while never mentioning the classified commendations that filled her service record, the successful missions that had saved countless lives, the innovations in battlefield medicine that bore her signature. The woman who had redefined trauma surgery under combat conditions became a symbol of military failure rather than medical heroism. The final insult came when she was offered a choice that was no choice at all: accept responsibility for the mission's failure and retire with minimal benefits, or face a court-martial that would destroy her reputation while potentially revealing classified information that could endanger other medical personnel serving in similar units. She had chosen exile, transforming herself into someone who could disappear into the civilian medical world without leaving traces of her former identity. The surgeon who had once saved lives under impossible conditions became invisible in truth, haunting the edges of the medical world that had once celebrated her innovations and expertise. Harrison's face had undergone a complete transformation during Martinez's revelation, color draining from his cheeks as he realized the magnitude of his actions over the past months. The woman he had systematically humiliated was being described as one of the most skilled trauma surgeons in military history, a physician whose contributions to battlefield medicine had influenced treatment protocols worldwide. The other department heads sat in stunned silence, their understanding of workplace hierarchy and professional competence challenged by revelations that none of them had imagined possible. The janitor they had ignored for 3 years was revealed as someone whose medical expertise far exceeded their own, whose experience treating trauma under combat conditions represented knowledge that could not be acquired in civilian medical training. Emma remained kneeling among her scattered cleaning supplies, her scarred arms now fully visible to physicians who were beginning to understand that they had been working alongside medical royalty disguised as support staff. The tears that traced down her weathered cheeks were not for herself but for 11 colleagues whose sacrifices would never be properly acknowledged, whose deaths had been classified as unavoidable casualties rather than heroic acts of medical service. Emma's voice, when it finally broke the heavy silence that had settled over the conference room, carried none of the anger or bitterness that the assembled physicians expected to hear. Instead, her words came with the calm authority of someone who had faced far worse adversaries than institutional prejudice and emerged her integrity intact. Dr. Harrison was doing his job, she said, her statement stunning the room into renewed silence. The generosity of spirit required to defend the man who had tormented her was beyond the comprehension of most present, a demonstration of character that no medical school curriculum could teach. Harrison's mouth opened and closed wordlessly, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, shame, and disbelief as he struggled to process what he was hearing. The woman he had systematically degraded for months was extending mercy to someone who had shown her none, displaying a grace under pressure that left seasoned department heads shaking their heads. Dr. Martinez studied Emma's face, recognizing the kind of moral courage that could only be forged in environments where life and death decisions had to be made without the luxury of time for contemplation. This was not weakness masquerading as strength, but rather the authentic leadership that emerged when someone had been tested by circumstances that would break lesser individuals. Captain Rodriguez, Martinez began, her use of the military title causing several physicians to straighten in their chairs. The hospital board has been looking for someone to head our new trauma surgery residency program. We need someone who can teach the next generation of surgeons what it really means to practice medicine under pressure. The offer represented everything that Emma had lost and more. A chance to reclaim her identity as a physician, to receive recognition for expertise that had been denied acknowledgement for 3 years. The position would come with full restoration of her medical credentials, a salary commensurate with her experience, and the respect of colleagues who would finally understand the depth of knowledge she brought to their institution. Congressional committees would reopen investigations into the Afghan mission, classified documents would be declassified, and the truth about Task Force Hippocrates would finally be revealed to medical communities that had unknowingly benefited from innovations developed by Emma's team. Her name would be added to medical journals that celebrated advances in trauma surgery, her techniques taught in medical schools across the country. Emma's response came without hesitation, her words reflecting values that transcended personal advancement or professional recognition. I appreciate the offer, Dr. Martinez, but I've found purpose in what I'm doing now. These floors don't clean themselves, and someone needs to make sure our operating rooms meet the standards our patients deserve. The statement revealed the depth of her transformation from someone who had once commanded elite medical teams to someone who found satisfaction in ensuring that other surgeons had sterile environments in which to save lives. Her happiness came not from recognition or authority, but from the knowledge that her work contributed to the mission of healing, even if her contributions remained invisible to those who benefited from them. Martinez's reply demonstrated her understanding of Emma's true nature, her recognition that some people were motivated by service rather than status. You know that teaching residents would be a form of service too. These young doctors need to learn from someone who understands what medicine means when everything else falls apart. The metaphor was apt, describing someone who had been refined by experiences that would have destroyed physicians who had never faced genuine life and death pressure. Emma studied the faces surrounding her, seeing curiosity mixed with dawning respect in the eyes of colleagues who were beginning to understand that they had been working alongside medical greatness disguised as custodial service. Her acceptance came with conditions that surprised no one who truly understood her. No media attention, she said, her desire for anonymity reflecting wisdom that transcended the ego-driven culture that consumed much of academic medicine. She had no need for newspaper articles or television interviews, no desire to be celebrated by administrators who had never performed surgery under combat conditions. The teaching position would allow her to honor the memory of her fallen teammates by ensuring that their innovations in battlefield medicine would be passed on to civilian surgeons who might never face combat but would certainly encounter trauma that tested their skills and resolve. She would teach these young physicians what it meant to serve in humility, to find strength in purpose rather than recognition. The transformation began immediately, with Dr. Martinez personally escorting Emma to the hospital's administrative offices where paperwork waited to restore credentials that had been suspended by political calculation rather than medical incompetence. The process took hours, with background checks revealing service records that had been classified at levels requiring special presidential authorization to access. Harrison's fate was sealed by his own actions rather than any vindictiveness on Emma's part. The hospital's board of directors, upon learning that a decorated combat surgeon had been systematically harassed while working under their employment, initiated an investigation that revealed patterns of workplace misconduct extending far beyond Emma's situation. Multiple complaints emerged from residents and nursing staff who had endured Harrison's arbitrary cruelty but had been too intimidated to report his behavior through official channels. His removal from supervisory positions came with recommendations that he undergo sensitivity training and anger management counseling before being considered for any role involving personnel management. The irony was not lost on anyone that the man who had questioned Emma's competence was now facing professional development requirements designed to teach him basic human decency. His career trajectory, once aimed toward department leadership, was permanently altered by his inability to recognize excellence when it was standing directly in front of him. Emma's first day as attending physician in the trauma surgery department began before dawn, just as her custodial shifts had started, but now she walked through the hospital corridors with the confidence of someone whose expertise was finally being utilized for its intended purpose. Her surgical scrubs, navy blue with the hospital logo embroidered on the chest, fit her like armor that had been waiting years to be worn again. The residents assigned to her service arrived early, driven by curiosity about the mysterious new attending who had appeared seemingly from nowhere with credentials that defied explanation. They had heard whispers about her background, fragments of information that painted her as someone whose medical experience exceeded anything they had encountered in their training. Emma's first lecture took place in the same conference room where her identity had been revealed, the space now transformed from a site of humiliation into a classroom where the next generation of trauma surgeons would learn techniques developed in the world's most dangerous medical environments. Her teaching style was direct and unadorned, focusing on practical skills rather than theoretical knowledge. "Your patient doesn't care about your medical school ranking," she told them, her words carrying the weight of experience that could only be gained through years of treating trauma under conditions where failure meant death. "They don't care about your research publications or your board scores. They only care whether you can keep them alive when everything goes wrong." She demonstrated surgical techniques that seemed to defy conventional medical wisdom, procedures that had been developed in field hospitals where traditional resources were unavailable. The residents watched in fascination as she performed complex procedures using improvised equipment, her methods revealing innovations that had been born from necessity and refined through countless repetitions under combat conditions. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had performed surgery while explosions shook the earth around her makeshift operating theater. Each movement was economical and purposeful, wasting no motion or time in procedures where seconds could mean the difference between life and death for patients whose survival depended entirely on her skill and judgment. The scars on her arms, now visible during surgical demonstrations, told stories that would never be spoken aloud but were understood by anyone who had faced mortal danger in service to healing. Each mark represented a moment when death had passed her by, leaving her alive to carry forward knowledge that could benefit countless future patients. Even Harrison was required to attend her training sessions, his presence mandated by the professional development requirements that had been imposed following the investigation into his conduct. He sat in the back of the conference room, his notebook open but his pen rarely moving, his attention focused on the woman who had become a living reminder of his professional failures. The other residents gave him a wide berth, their respect for Emma's expertise contrasting sharply with their recognition of his diminished status within the hospital hierarchy. His attendance was uncomfortable for everyone involved, but Emma treated him with the same professional courtesy she extended to all medical personnel, demonstrating that true strength did not require the humiliation of defeated adversaries. Her teaching philosophy emphasized compassion alongside technical competence, recognizing that the best surgeons combine surgical skill with genuine concern for patient welfare. She taught residents to see beyond medical conditions to the human beings who trusted them with their lives, to understand that healing required emotional intelligence as well as technical expertise. "Remember that every patient has a family waiting for news," she would tell them during morning rounds. "Your job is not just to fix what's broken, but to preserve hope when everything seems hopeless." Sometimes the most important surgery you perform is the conversation you have with someone's loved ones. The lessons she shared went beyond surgical technique to encompass the moral dimensions of medical practice. She taught residents about making difficult decisions under pressure, about maintaining composure when facing cases that challenged their confidence, about finding strength in service to others rather than personal advancement. Her office, located in the same wing where she had once mopped floors, became a sanctuary where struggling residents could seek guidance from someone who understood the weight of medical responsibility. The walls were decorated with photographs of her new students, their faces bright with the enthusiasm of physicians who were learning what it meant to practice medicine with both competence and compassion. The wooden box that had once held her military medals now contained letters from patients whose lives had been saved by residents trained in her techniques. Each letter represented a life preserved, a family kept whole, a future made possible by medical knowledge that had been passed from combat zones to civilian hospitals through the dedication of someone who had chosen service over recognition. Emma's transformation from invisible janitor to respected attending physician was complete, but her greatest satisfaction came not from professional rehabilitation but from the knowledge that she was serving her country in a different way, preparing the next generation of healers to carry forward innovations that had been purchased with the sacrifice of 11 colleagues whose names would never appear on memorial walls. The evening shift brought quiet moments when Emma could reflect on the journey that had carried her from the mountains of Afghanistan to the teaching hospitals of American medicine. The ghosts of her fallen teammates still visited her dreams, but now their voices carried approval rather than accusation, recognizing that their sacrifice had meaning beyond the classified mission reports that documented their deaths. In choosing grace over revenge, service over recognition, Emma had found a path toward healing that no congressional hearing could have provided. Her story became legend among hospital staff who witnessed daily proof that true strength lay not in dominance over others, but in the willingness to lift others toward excellence through patient teaching and moral example. 6 months later, the trauma bay at Metropolitan General Hospital buzzed with controlled chaos as a multi-vehicle accident brought in casualties that would test everything Emma's residents had learned. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a second-year resident who had initially dismissed the quiet janitor she occasionally saw in the hallways, now found herself leading a trauma team using techniques that had been developed in Afghan field hospitals. The patient on the table had suffered massive internal bleeding, the kind of injury that would have been a death sentence without the innovative vascular repair methods Emma had perfected under enemy fire. Walsh's hands moved with confidence that surprised her, muscle memory guiding procedures she had practiced countless times under Emma's watchful supervision. Control the bleeding first, worry about perfection later, Emma's voice echoed in Walsh's mind as she worked to save a life that hung by the thinnest thread. The technique she employed had been born from desperation in a mountain aid station where traditional surgical approaches would have failed, now adapted to civilian trauma surgery with modifications that made it suitable for hospital environments. The other residents worked around her with the kind of seamless coordination that Emma had drilled into them through months of intensive training. Each person knew their role, understood their responsibilities, and trusted their teammates to perform at levels that exceeded what any of them had thought possible when they first entered Emma's program. Dr. Martinez watched from the observation deck, her satisfaction evident as she witnessed the practical application of knowledge that had been hard-won in places where medical textbooks provided inadequate guidance. The residents below demonstrated not just technical competence, but the kind of calm professionalism that could only be taught by someone who had faced genuine life and death pressure. The patient's vital signs stabilized as Walsh completed the vascular repair, her success representing more than just individual achievement. This was validation of Emma's belief that battlefield innovations could be adapted to benefit civilian patients, that knowledge gained through sacrifice and loss could find new purpose in peacetime medical practice. Emma herself remained in the background, her presence felt but not obtrusive as her students applied lessons that had been written in blood on foreign battlefields. She had learned to find satisfaction in their successes rather than seeking recognition for her role in their development, understanding that the greatest teachers were often invisible to those who benefited from their guidance. The success in the trauma bay rippled through the hospital's medical community, with other departments requesting consultation on cases that required the kind of innovative thinking that Emma's program was developing. Her residents became known for their ability to handle complex trauma with confidence that seemed disproportionate to their experience level. Word of the program's success spread beyond Metropolitan General, with medical schools and trauma centers across the country requesting information about training methods that were producing such exceptional results. Emma declined most interview requests, preferring to let her residents speak about techniques they had mastered rather than drawing attention to her own role in their education. The wooden box in her office had grown heavier over the months, filled with letters from patients whose lives had been saved by physicians trained in her methods. Each letter represented a ripple effect extending far beyond the original sacrifice of her teammates, their innovations continuing to preserve life in ways they could never have imagined. Harrison's journey toward redemption had been slower and more painful than Emma's rise to recognition. The sensitivity training and anger management sessions had forced him to confront patterns of behavior that he had never acknowledged as problematic, requiring him to develop empathy that should have been fundamental to medical practice. His interactions with Emma remained formal and professional, marked by a respect that was tinged with shame for his previous conduct. She treated him with the same courtesy she extended to all medical personnel, demonstrating through example the kind of leadership that elevated others rather than diminishing them. The change in hospital culture was subtle but unmistakable, with Emma's approach to medical education influencing how other departments treated their residents and support staff. Her emphasis on dignity and respect created an environment where learning flourished, where mistakes became opportunities for growth rather than occasions for humiliation. Dr. Martinez had implemented Emma's teaching philosophy across multiple residency programs, recognizing that technical competence without moral character produced physicians who might save lives but could not truly heal. The integration of combat-tested medical techniques with civilian trauma care had become a model for other institutions seeking to improve their emergency medicine capabilities. The evening Emma received notification that her program had been selected for a National Medical Education Award. She stood in the same hospital corridor where she had once pushed a cleaning cart, watching new residents learn procedures that had been developed in places whose names they would never know. The young doctors worked with confidence that had been earned through rigorous training, their hands steady as they applied techniques that represented the distilled wisdom of physicians who had faced the ultimate test of medical skill. Each successful procedure honored the memory of colleagues who had died, believing that their sacrifice served a purpose greater than any individual life. Emma's reflection in the corridor window showed a woman who had found peace through service, whose greatest satisfaction came not from personal recognition but from knowing that her knowledge continued to preserve life in ways that multiplied far beyond her direct involvement. The scars on her arms had become symbols of resilience rather than reminders of loss. The letter she wrote that evening was addressed to no specific recipient, a message intended for teammates who existed now only in memory but whose influence continued to shape the practice of medicine in ways that would never be fully documented. She wrote of residents who saved lives using techniques developed in mountain aid stations, of innovations that had found new purpose in civilian hospitals, of sacrifice that continued to bear fruit in places far removed from the battlefields where it had been planted. Her words carried gratitude for lessons learned in the hardest possible circumstances, for knowledge that had been purchased with blood but now served to preserve rather than mourn the loss of life. The letter would never be sent, but writing it provided closure that no congressional hearing or military decoration could have offered. The program Emma had built would outlast her involvement, creating a legacy of medical excellence that honored fallen comrades while serving the needs of patients who would never know the price that had been paid for their survival. In choosing service over revenge, teaching over recognition, she had found a way to transform tragedy into triumph, loss into lasting contribution. The young doctors who learned her techniques would carry them forward into careers that spanned decades, treating patients whose lives would be preserved by innovations developed in places where hope seemed impossible. Each successful procedure would represent not just individual achievement but continuation of a mission that transcended the circumstances of its origin. Emma's story became legend among those who understood that true heroism often remained hidden, that the greatest victories were sometimes achieved by those who sought no recognition for their sacrifices. Her transformation from invisible janitor to respected teacher demonstrated that redemption was possible even after the greatest losses, that purpose could be found in service even when justice seemed elusive. The hospital corridors that had once witnessed her humiliation now echoed with the voices of residents discussing techniques that had been perfected under conditions they could barely imagine. Their confidence built on foundations that had been laid in places where medical miracles were daily necessities rather than exceptional achievements. 5 years had passed since that moment in the conference room when a torn sleeve changed everything. The woman who had once been dismissed as worthless now stood before an auditorium filled with the nation's most distinguished trauma surgeons, delivering the keynote address at the American College of Surgeons annual conference. Emma's voice carried across the silent hall as she spoke about innovations in battlefield medicine that had revolutionized civilian trauma care. Behind her, a presentation displayed statistics that told the story of lives saved using techniques developed in places where failure meant watching young soldiers die on improvised operating tables. The audience included physicians whose careers had been built on research conducted in comfortable academic environments, their expertise derived from textbooks and controlled clinical trials. Yet they listened with rapt attention to someone whose knowledge had been forged in circumstances that challenged every assumption about what was medically possible. Every technique I'm sharing tonight was paid for with the lives of colleagues who believed that knowledge should serve the living, Emma said, her words causing several physicians in the front row to lean forward. These innovations didn't emerge from laboratory research or clinical studies, they were born from desperation and refined through necessity in places where traditional medicine was inadequate. The techniques she described had become standard protocol in trauma centers across 3 continents, their effectiveness proven by thousands of successful procedures performed by surgeons who had learned them in residency programs modeled after Emma's approach. Each method represented the distilled wisdom of physicians who had faced death daily and refused to accept it as inevitable. Dr. Martinez sat in the front row, her pride evident as she watched her former colleague receive the recognition that had been delayed by political calculation and institutional prejudice. The woman who had cleaned operating rooms now commanded the respect of surgeons whose reputations had been built on far less challenging accomplishments. In the audience, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, now chief resident at a major teaching hospital, took notes on advanced techniques that built upon the foundation Emma had provided years earlier. The confidence she displayed while treating complex trauma had opened doors to opportunities that seemed impossible when she first encountered the quiet janitor who had transformed her understanding of medicine. Harrison sat near the back of the auditorium, his presence a testament to the personal growth that had followed his fall from administrative grace. The sensitivity training and professional development he had undergone had led to genuine transformation, teaching him humility that had been absent during his years of wielding authority over subordinates. The standing ovation that followed Emma's presentation lasted nearly 5 minutes, with trauma surgeons from around the world recognizing someone whose contributions had elevated their entire profession. The applause represented more than professional courtesy, it was acknowledgement that they had witnessed something rare in academic medicine, authentic heroism disguised as quiet service. Later that evening, Emma stood alone on the hotel balcony overlooking a city where thousands of people slept peacefully, unaware that their safety was protected by physicians whose skills had been enhanced by knowledge purchased with sacrifice in distant mountains. The lights below stretched to the horizon like earthbound stars, each one representing lives that could be saved using techniques developed by colleagues who would never receive recognition for their contributions. The medal she had received that night lay on the dresser inside, its weight insignificant compared to the satisfaction that came from knowing her work continued to preserve life in ways that multiplied far beyond her direct involvement. Awards and accolades meant little to someone whose greatest achievement was invisible, the transformation of tragedy into triumph through dedicated service. Her phone buzzed with messages from residents and colleagues around the world, physicians whose lives had been changed by exposure to methods that challenged conventional wisdom about trauma surgery. Each message represented another link in a chain of knowledge that extended from Afghan field hospitals to the most advanced medical centers, connecting past sacrifice with present service. The photograph she carried in her wallet showed 12 medical professionals standing outside a field hospital, their faces bright with exhaustion and purpose. Only she remained to tell their story, but their legacy lived on through every successful procedure performed by surgeons who had learned their techniques, every life preserved using innovations born from their dedication to healing under impossible conditions. Emma's transformation from invisible janitor to celebrated surgeon had become legend in medical circles, a story told in medical schools to illustrate that true excellence could emerge from the most unexpected circumstances. But she knew the real miracle was not her personal redemption but the continuation of a mission that transcended individual recognition. The young doctors who had learned her methods were now teaching others, creating ripple effects that would influence medical practice for generations. Each successful trauma surgery performed using battlefield techniques honored the memory of fallen colleagues while serving patients who would never know the price paid for their survival. As midnight approached, Emma opened her laptop and began writing the final chapter of the book she had been working on for 3 years. The manuscript would document innovations in trauma surgery without revealing classified details, sharing knowledge in ways that served the living while honoring the dead. The dedication page bore 11 names that had never appeared in medical journals, physicians whose contributions to battlefield medicine would finally receive acknowledgement through civilian applications of their techniques. Their sacrifice had meaning that extended far beyond the mountain aid station where they had died, touching lives in ways they could never have imagined. Emma's story had come full circle, from decorated combat surgeon to invisible janitor to celebrated teacher, each phase serving a purpose in the larger mission of preserving life through dedicated service. The scars on her arms had become symbols of resilience, reminders that strength could emerge from the darkest circumstances when guided by unwavering commitment to healing others. The woman who had once cleaned operating rooms now inspired surgeons who worked in those same facilities, her influence rippling through medical communities that would never fully understand the journey that had brought such wisdom into their midst. In choosing service over recognition, purpose over revenge, Emma had discovered that true heroism often remained hidden from public view but generated consequences that changed the world in profound and lasting ways. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.